Thank you for the opportunity of coming together to study the structure and form of speech and meaningful discourse. We pray tonight as we continue our investigation into the categories that are necessary for an understanding of truth, that the Spirit of truth himself may be present with us, that we might come to a deeper understanding of those things that you have revealed to us. For we ask these things in the name of Christ. Amen. 2 weeks ago, as we were completing our study of informal fallacies, time ran out before I had the opportunity to go into a discussion of the either-or fallacy. And that slipped my mind last week, and some of you raised the question as to whether or not I would deal with the either-or fallacy. Now do I have it straight? Is that correct? Is that correct, Rick? Okay. Then I'd like to take a little bit of time this evening to sort of backtrack and go over the either-or fallacy and then continue with our study of the formal propositions and in further preparation for Venn diagrams. Let's look then at the either-or fallacy, which is also sometimes called the black-white fallacy. Quite simply, the either-or fallacy or the black-white fallacy is that fallacy that is committed when a person's options are limited to two when there are, in fact, three or more options of a given proposition. For example, if I say that a man is either Negroid or Caucasian, would that statement be true or false? No, it wouldn't be true or false? No, Mary, it has to be true or false. It can't be.
I was writing and I thought,
Is it true or false? It's false. Why? Well, there's one other category. What do we call it? The Mongoloid, the Oriental delineation at that point. And so when we say that you're one of two categories, when in fact there's a third, we're committing the either-or fallacy, the black-white fallacy. That is to say that in this particular case there's a third alternative, an alternative that's normally classified by the term tertium quid. Tertium-quid. A tertium quid is a third alternative and often is used when people assume that there are only two. Let me give you a couple of other examples of statements, and let me ask you to respond whether or not they are valid or invalid. A man is either utterly depraved or perfectly righteous. A man is either utterly depraved or perfectly righteous. Now this involves theology as well as logic. A man is either utterly depraved or perfectly righteous. True or false?
What does utterly mean?
Well, what does the word utter mean? Without reference to a cow. With two T's rather than D's. What does it mean?
Totally.
Completely or totally? All right. Now, is it true that one is one or the other?
no, I'm not either one.
You're not either one. From a Reformation perspective, would that statement be true?
True.
No.
No, it's false.
It's false. You're probably thinking, this is why I used the phrase that I did, you're probably thinking of the Reformed concept of total depravity, which is distinguished from utter depravity. What's the difference?
He's utterly depraved would be as depraved as one possibly could be.
Right. Utter depravity means as depraved as one could possibly be. Total depravity has respect to the fact that the effects of sin influence and infect the whole of man. That is his mind, his body, his soul, his spirit, his thought life, and all the rest. That sin infects every part of the man, but it doesn't mean that man always behaves is in such a fashion in which he is as depraved as he possibly could be. So that would be a false dilemma. That would be an either-or fallacy, because there is a tertium quid. A man who is marred by sin, but is not as sinful as he could conceivably be. All right, let's try another example. Jesus has either a divine nature or a human nature. What is it?
False.
False. Well, there's another possibility. What's the other possibility?
Having both.
Having both. You see. All right. Now, it's relatively easy to see the either-or fallacy in its informal manifestation. But there is a problem that's related to the opposite of the either-or fallacy. And that's the what I call the fallacy of the impossible tertium quid. The fallacy of the impossible tertium quid. This is the flip side of the either-or fallacy. That is, when people seek to locate a tertium quid when it must be either-or. There are some situations in propositions that are either-or. And people try to arrive at an Aufgehoben, a synthesis that will resolve the tension between the two poles. All right? Let me give you some examples. Well, first of all, let me give you some more basic information for this. Prefixes like non, im, I-M, in, I-N, un, U-N, or dis, D-I-S, are the kind of prefixes that you will frequently find with words that are involved in the impossible tertium quid fallacy. Let me give you an example in concrete terms. The Bible is either errant or inerrant. True or false? Bill says true. Why? The Bible is either errant or inerrant.
They're antithetical.
All right, they're antithetical. I am making a distinction between two categorical statements: a universal and a universal negative and a universal affirmative. Let me state it this way: if the Bible is inerrant, can there be any errors? Because the term inerrancy is a universal term, a term of total inclusion. It includes everything in the category outside of errancy. Errancy is one category. Everything outside of the category of errancy would be inerrant. If there's one error, would the document be inerrant? Huh? No, it would be errant. All right. Now, if there are no errors, could the document be errant?
Why did it take you so long?
No. In other words, dealing with the question of errancy, as soon as you set the question of errancy vis-a-vis inerrancy, you only have two possible alternatives. Now, here is where we find a mistake commonly made among theologians. I don't know how many times I've talked to professors of theology with respect to the scriptures, and I would say to them, do you hold to the notion that the Bible is inerrant? And they would say, no. Oh, well then you believe the Bible is errant. Oh no. So let me try it again. Do you believe the Bible to be inerrant? No. Do you believe it to be errant? No, no. It's got to be one or the other. Well, I don't like those terms, they say. Fine, if you don't like the terms. I'm not asking you to use the terms. If you never, on your own free will, if you don't like to use those terms, fine. But the concepts we're talking about now, just between you and me, you've denied them both. Is that possible? Can you deny both of those? When with respect to the question of error, everything that is possible to say about the question of error, whether it's there or not, is incorporated in one of those two statements, errant or inerrant. Do you see that? It's got to be one or the other. If they don't like the terms, if they find the terms not helpful and misleading, that's another statement. But the concept, it's got to be one or the other, does it not? Let's look at another example. Something is either possible or impossible. Is there any other alternative? What other word might we use? Probable. But is that which is probable possible or impossible? In other words, the term probable describes a degree of one of the two alternatives. Something can be possible to a lesser or greater degree. And we might describe or try to sharpen our category at that point by using words like probable or improbable. But don't you see that possible and impossible incorporate the whole question of possibility? If something can be done, is it possible? Can we say that something is impossible if its possibility is astronomically improbable? Let me give you the following excerpt from a sermon I heard preached in the city of Pittsburgh a few years ago, where a man made this statement. He said, the chances of the universe beginning at a point in time by having the exact number of chemicals and atoms and particles come together in a particular configuration at a particular moment in time is, to believe that, he says, we have to realize that the odds against that happening, and he gave some astronomical figure like 10 zillion trillion googolplex to 1 against that happening in a given moment. So let's just say that he used the figure 1 trillion to 1 against it. Then he went on to say, therefore, it's mathematically impossible for the universe to have happened that way. Now, is that true? No, it's mathematically what? Highly improbable, you see. Enormously improbable. But is it impossible? On the basis of his very statement, he's just given us one possibility out of 10 trillion. Can we therefore make it impossible? It may approach impossibility by a high degree of improbability, but it's either possible or impossible. Is it not? Now, how about another set of opposites? Personal and impersonal. Personal and impersonal. Where does that come into theological discussion?
Nature of God.
In the nature of God. Paul Tillich, for example, has sought to refine our language about God and try to go beyond theism, to search for the God beyond God, arguing that all of our language about God is analogical and in the final analysis reduces God to human form. And he tried to transcend that. And if you ask Tillich and his followers, is God personal? What's the answer? No. Is he impersonal? No. Now how can he deny both? Well, you see, because personality and impersonality are human terms of description. And since God is not a man, we cannot describe God in human categories such as personality and impersonality. And so Tillich sought to go beyond the ancient dilemma between personality and impersonality to speak of a God who what? Who is neither, but he's rather what?
Grounded person.
The ground of personality. But what's the obvious question at that point?
Is the ground of personality personal?
Is the ground of personality personal or impersonal? Right? Because it's got to be one or the other. Even God, as transcendent as he may be, even if we describe him as wholly other, he still has to be one or the other. He's either or non-personal. He either exists or he does not exist. No? Or any other alternatives. All right, I'd like to give you a little exercise that I went through this past week on this very question and ask you to use the principles of proposition that we've already studied together and see if you can deal with it. I listened to a sermon on tape this past week, a man who was speaking on the problem of antinomy within the Christian faith, and he was affirming the fact that it's liberating to the Christian when he realizes that we often have unreconcilable antinomies, or at least apparently unreconcilable antinomies in the Scriptures, and we see that both of these poles of the antinomy or contradiction are clearly taught with abundant evidence to support it, but we must, in Christian love, in terms of our own limited understanding, submit to these unresolved antinomies and trust God at this point. And then to illustrate that particular point, he used from the pulpit 2 excerpts from sermons preached the previous year in the same church by 2 different men who were preaching a day apart from each other, and both of their sermons were on tape. The one man that he quoted in his tape excerpt was Tom Skinner. The other man was myself. Tom Skinner was preaching in this church during a time of a preaching mission, preaching in the vein of evangelism. At the conclusion of his sermon, he gave an altar call. And he asked people who wanted to commit their lives to Christ to come forward to the front of the church. And then the tape excerpt comes on, and Skinner says in this tape excerpt, what you are saying when you come to the front of the church is you are saying to God, I choose to be born again. And he flips off the tape. Takes that quotation from Skinner, where Skinner tells the people when they come forward, they are saying, I choose to be born again. Then he flips on the next tape, which is an excerpt from my sermon, where I was preaching from John 3, talking about what is necessary for regeneration to take place. And the title of the sermon was Flesh is Flesh, that the flesh profits nothing, that man, according to his natural ability, and because he's in bondage to sin, etc., can do nothing to affect his own regeneration. And the quote that comes out of my mouth on the tape then in this sermon that I heard last week is, you ask me what you can do if you're an unregenerate man to affect your regeneration? I tell you, absolutely nothing. All right. That was my quote. Absolutely nothing. Skinner's quote was, you can choose to be born again. Then this minister who was preaching the sermon on antinomy went on to say that both positions, both men, were preaching from the same book, and both men had abundant biblical support for the statements that they were making, and that we didn't have to choose between them. One was not right and the other was wrong, but they were both clearly teaching the truth of God. All right? Can that be? Can that be? Could Skinner and I both be right? Paul?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. All right, let's put this in propositional form. All right? let's take the statements, I choose to be born again. Is it fair to translate that statement to say that man can do something to affect his own regeneration? He can choose it. There is something that man can do. He can choose it. Is that right? No. And we can take my statement and say, man can do nothing. Now, are nothing and something contradictory? I mean, absolute contraries? You bet they are. If a man can do nothing, then he cannot do something. And if he can do something, it is improper to say that he can do nothing, because there is something that he can do, no matter how small it is. In this case, he can choose to be born again. Well, I wouldn't mind if the preacher would stand up there, I wouldn't mind too much, and say, look, Skinner's right, Sproul's wrong, Sproul's taking an extreme position, here he goes with his Calvinism again, and all the rest, and he gave a devastating critique of Calvinism. He wanted to do that, that's fine. It wouldn't bother me if he stood up and he said, yay for Sproul, Skinner's distorted the biblical faith, Skinner's wrong at this point, he's made a statement that he can't back up scripturally. That wouldn't bother me either. But to stand there and say that we're both right is to deal in absurdity. Now, can we translate those terms at all and put them in the square of opposition? Let's put it this way. No man can do anything. That's the way we translate. No man can do anything. For Skinner's statement. No, for my statement. No man can do anything. All right? What kind of statement would that be?
Universal negative.
Universal negative. Well, what is that? A-E-I-O-O. E. All right? And what if how would you translate mine? All right. Men can do something. Or at least some men can do anything. What would that be? I. What's the relationship between E and I? In terms of immediate inference, Rick? Contradiction. An apparent contradiction? Or is it just a paradox that under further scrutiny can be resolved? Huh? Is an absolute contradiction?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. All right, that's the other side of the either-or fallacy. Good. But I just wanted to show you how just this week I ran into this problem again from a well-meaning Christian evangelical minister. Makes a public statement saying both can be true. Now, let me ask you this further. If it's true that both can be true, what are the implications of that for the Scriptures? Could we also argue that God can be God and not be God at the same time? Mm-hmm. Can we also argue that Jesus Christ is the only way to God and not the only way to God at the same time? Can we argue this way? Thou shalt have no other gods before me, thou shalt have some other gods before me? If some and no are not mutually exclusive terms, I'd now like to turn your attention back, if I can, to this business of working with propositional categories, and move now to an attempt to learn some more shorthand in preparation for our learning how to diagram statements, propositional statements, to test their validity formally. Okay? And to do this may be a little laborious at now, and it's going to require a little bit of simple memorization. But remember, we use the designations S and P and M as abbreviations, as shorthand for different parts of the syllogism already. What does the S stand for?
Subject.
The subject term. The P stands for predicate. The M for the middle term. All right, for now, for our purposes right now, we're just going to consider the subject and the predicate, the S and the P categories. Now, if we let the figure 0 represent the null form or the nothingness quotient, we can set up the following sort of a symbolic algebra or logical algebra. If we say there are S's, there are men, or we make a simple statement, there are things. There are ants, right? Then we would diagram it this way. The S, it's the subject, equals nothing or something?
Something.
All right. Suppose we say there are no ants. There are no ants. That is, there are no members of the category that we're talking about. We can state it this way. S equals O. I maybe should have started here and have been a little clearer. Start with a negative rather than a positive. When we make this formula, S equals O, we're stating the negative in this formula. You understand that? There are no members to this class. S equals O. There are no ants. Right? Now, when we put a line through it, we are negating the null factor. We are, in a sense, making a double negative, which gives us a positive. When I say there are ants, then I'm saying that S is not nullified. You understand that? Who doesn't understand it? Why don't I look at the women? It's a course in logic, that's why I look at the women. Do you all understand that? Is that clear yet? All right, let's hope that it becomes more clear. All right, now let's use S to represent the category. S is satire, and P stands for poem. Okay? Are all satires poems? Are all poems satires? Huh? Are they? Are some satires poems?
Yes.
Okay. Now how do we diagram it when sum of S is P or sum of P is S? Very simple. SP. SP, the abbreviation SP, refers to the common denominator between subject and predicate. Got that? All right. Now, let's see how we can use this kind of shorthand for our different kinds of propositions. An E proposition, what is the E proposition again? Refresh your memory, Bill?
No such and such.
No S is P, right? No S is P. So, when I say we put this down by the formula SP equals null or 0, what are we saying? What does that mean?
Some P's are
No S is P.
You're saying that's what that?
That when we have the E proposition, the common denominator is nullified. Do you see that? The SP factor is nullified. No SP exists because no S is P. This will become more clear, I think, as we go along. I get them all up here for you. Let's look at an I proposition. This is E. The I proposition is SP nullified the O. So that becomes positive. That in the I proposition there is a positive quotient. See. What is the I proposition? Some S is P, right? So there is some area of commonality between subject and predicate. So there is some SP quotient there, isn't there? So since there is something in SP in the I, then we nullify the no. Okay. Now then, the A proposition. What's the A proposition?
All S is P.
All S is P. So the SP factor, this is the way we designate this, that the SP factor, the P, is negated by the little line above it, meaning non-P. And then finally, the O, which is the SP factor, the S non-P, is affirmed. All right, now, I'm going to try to make this clear to you by means of diagrams. Just keep these little figures I just gave you now for further reference, and I hope that they'll be a little bit more clear to you in a minute. Now we're going to use circles. We're on our way to Venn diagrams. We're going to use circles to how we do these things. A circle that is shaded may be used to indicate the null factor. Quite simply, S is O. That is, there are no S's. And so we diagram S by drawing a circle and shading it in. That means there are no S's. Now, what if we take S is not nullified? How would we diagram S? That is, there is something in S. A clear circle. It's simple. See? Now, let's put S and P involved in this. So we could do the same thing with P. If I said P is O, how would we diagram that? How do we diagram that, Bucky? P is O. Shaded in circle. Because there's a total negation or nullification of the predicate. And if we say P is not nullified, how would we draw the circle for P? Same way we do with S. All right. Now, the trick comes when we get them together. Now, if we want to take the relationship of S to P, we draw two circles, one for S and one for P, and we overlap the circles. Got that? The circle on the left is S, the circle on the right is P. Now, what do we call, do you suppose, this middle area where they overlap, the overlapping area? That would be the common, the point, the level of commonality. And how would we state that with our letters? SP. Okay? All right. Now, over here, we have S non-P. And here we have non-S, P. Got that? Now it should be starting to get clear to you by showing you it on the diagram. See how often when we put these things in the diagram form, it's easier to see what we're talking about because you see it. This section in the middle, the SP factor, refers to that which S and P have in common. That to the left, that is in the S circle, is all of S that is not P. And over here is all of P that is not S. All right? Now, let's go into the diagramming of the different propositions. Let's first begin with the A proposition. How do we state the A proposition again? All S is P. All men are mortal. Okay? All S is P. Now, and in our, let's see, all S is P. That would be S, non-P is nullified. Now, here's the two circles, one for S and one for P. This is the S circle and this is the P circle. Now, how much of S is P? How much of S is P in the A proposition? Come on. All of it. All right. How much of S is non-P? None of it. All right. So, what do we shade?
Just that middle part there.
We shade this part, right? Because there's no commonality between S and P, right? S and P have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. Rich. All S is P. No common ground. If all S is P, do the subject and predicate have any common ground? They have a whole lot of them. Okay? Now, so it can't go in there. All right? All S is P. Is there any part of S that is not P? Is there any part of the S circle here that's not in the P circle? Where is it, Laurie? Would you come up here and point it out for the court? Huh?
Can I play from here?
No, you come up here and do it. I want all these eligible guys to see you live.
Well, what I see is that all this is not P.
All of this is outside of the P circle. And if all S is P, right, then this has to be shaded in. You get that? Huh? You don't.
What about the common ground there in the middle?
What would we call that?
I mean, isn't that the way that's defined or not?
Huh? It's SP. See? Huh? But all of S has got to be in P. Now, where you're getting confused is, you think, well, look, we started off with S here and we're knocking some of S off. No, we want to get it all, we're trying to show that all S is P in the proposition. And we do that by making all of S within the P circle.
It's still in P there.
Does this mean that all P is S? No. That's why we can show you, see, that you can't necessarily turn around subject and predicate. All men are blind. Are all blind people men? If formally, is that statement true? Not materially, of course it isn't. Okay? Let's put it this way. All men are mortal, so I won't confuse you. Are all mortal beings men? Is a dog mortal? Huh? All men are mammals. Are all mammals men?
No.
All S is P, but not all of P is S. We have all this out here. Now let's look at an E proposition. The E proposition states what about S and P?
No S is P.
No S is P. All right? So that means that the SP quotient is what?
0.
Is 0. Good. Now, here's S. And here's P. Where's the SP factor? In the diagram, where's the SP factor? Right here. All right. What do we shade on the E proposition?
In the middle.
Why?
Because there's no common ground between S and P.
There's no common ground between S and P because no S is P. No part of S is P. No man is invisible. All right? Or no man is a cat. See? Men and cats. They do not have common grounds. Do you understand that? Does everybody understand that? All right, let's go to the I proposition. How do we state the I proposition with S and P? Have you ever had a more exciting time in all your life? Really, really exciting. I is what? Some S is P. Boy, if you haven't been here for the first 3 lectures, if you could see how people are lost after having this. Some S is P. All right? Some dogs are brown. Okay? Now, is there an SP factor? Is that the way we state it? No? Well, how's the SP factor in this? Okay. Now, here's how we state, rather than using shading in this case, when we get down to the I and O categories, we use another thing besides the shading. We use the X to indicate the middle term, or the commonality. Here's S, and here's P. Some S is P. Now, why don't we use shading here? Exactly, Bill. We can't use the shading for the particulars, only for the universals. Because if we shaded out S and just left the S in the middle, the SP factor, we would be making it what? All S is P. So we can't shade it. And the same thing with the P factor. So rather than shade it, we use the X. We mark the X at the point of commonality. All right? Now, some S is P. Where do we put the X? Here? To indicate the thing? What? Here. that locates for us the sum, the point where sum of S is P. All right? Now, we also leave open the S that is not P and the P that is not necessarily S. Because when we say sum S is P, do we mean that sum S, or that all P's are partly S? Can't reverse them, can you? All right, now, the final one then is the O proposition. The O proposition, which stated what? Sum, how do we say it? S is not P. Okay? There's the S circle, the P circle. Right? Now, sum S is not P. Where do we put the X, Bucky? Sum S is not P. Here? Here. All right. Now, here we have the area where S and P come together. Now, does this designate the part of S that is not P? Where is the part of S that is not P in the diagram? It's outside the P circle. So we put it here. Get it? This is really simple. I know we're going over it awfully quickly, but it's really very simple if you look at it for a couple of minutes. Sum S is not P. Here's the part of S that's not P. Rick, you got that?
No. Keep coming up with it backwards every time.
Here's the P circle. Sum S is not P. Now, if we said sum S was P, where would we find the place where P and S overlap? Here. All right, now sum S is not P. It's here. You see that? Now, some men are clowns, Rich. Is that right?
Yes.
All right, now, let's take the statement, some men are clowns. What kind of a proposition is that? Mary?
I.
An I proposition. What do you mean by an I proposition?
There's some intersection between the two. Well,
What does an I proposition do? Is an I proposition a negative or affirmative proposition?
affirmative.
Does it affirm something or deny it?
Affirmative.
How do you know that an I proposition is affirmative? Mr. Swag? Without looking at your notes, Mr. Swag, I ought to jump out at you by now. How do you know that an I proposition in formal category logic is always affirmative? Because I said so. No, come on, Rick. How do you know it, Susie? Forget the diagram. There's a quicker way to know than that. How do you know?
It's the second vowel in the first one.
Man, there's a man who's got to know how to learn something. Remember? What's the Latin word for to affirm? Affirmo. What are the first two vowels in that? A and I. What are the two forms of propositions that are affirmative? A and I. What's the Latin word to deny? Nego. What are the two vowels in nego? E-no. What are the two forms of negative propositions? E-no. How can you ever forget that? You forgot it. Thinking. Huh? I, firmo. No I in nego. See? But there is an I affirmative. So, some men are clowns is an I proposition. Is it affirmative or negative?
Affirmative.
It's affirmative. Okay? Is it universal or particular? Particular. So it's a particular affirmative. All right? So, how would we state it in terms of S and P?
Some S's.
Where's the subject of the sentence, Laurie?
Men.
Men. Some S is, what's that? Clowns. See, we're predicating something about men. Some men. So we would say what? Some S is P. Right? How would you diagram that, Dick? Come up here and diagram that. Come on, Dick. Try it. Just give it a try. Don't want to? Oh, okay. Rick, well, come on up here and diagram that. Some S is P. All right, what are those two circles you put there on the board?
It's S and P
S and P. Now, how do we indicate some S is P?
with an X.
And with an X, because it's a particular rather than universal. We only use shading for what, Susie?
There is none.
Or if there is all. Universals. A and E. Get shading.
It'll either be here or here.
Some S is P. Now, what part of that S is P?
This part.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. You got that? Is that right?
That's right.
Huh? How many say it's right? How many say it's wrong? How many didn't vote? How many didn't vote that they didn't vote? All right. Some S is P. That's exactly right. All right. Now, all women are inferior. True. What kind of a statement is that? All women are inferior. Besides it's, being self-evident. To God. Mary, to God. And men. All right. All women are inferior.
Universal negative.
Formal statement. Formally considered. We're not considering the material truth of the statement. We are only considering its formal truth at this point. Its formal dimensions. How would you diagram that statement formally? All women are inferior. Marie, what kind of a proposition is it? A, E, I, or O? Why?
Universal affirmative.
Yes, it affirms something universally of everybody in that category. All the people in the category of women are inferior. And I like it, maybe it fools you there because inferiority, you see, the reason I use that, is a negative thing. But in terms of the formal statement, we are making an assertion universally about all women. So it's still an A proposition. See? Mary, come over here and show us a diagram of that. All women are inferior. All right? Is that right? Is all S P in this diagram? Is there any S left that is not P? Is there any exception to the universal affirmative? Nope, she's gotten rid of all of that. So all S is P. All that's left of S here is P. You get that? All right, now, thank you, Mary. Can we use these diagrams in this way to deal with syllogisms to see whether or not they're valid? Bill?
Seems like if you diagram one statement, which would be your major premise, and then diagram the conclusion, and look for areas of overlap.
All right. What we do, though, is do it with one diagram. But it has to have more than two circles. It's got to have three. Because what have we not considered so far tonight?
Conclusions?
No?
Middle term.
The middle term. The conclusion, does the conclusion deal with the S at all, Mary?
Isn't... Yeah, it does.
Uh-huh. Okay. But we haven't learned how to demonstrate graphically the middle term and put them together. Do you see now why I didn't want to do that tonight? All in one night. We got to get this down first. And then we can move to putting the three together. And what I'm trying to get you to see is that what do you do when you get into a debate with somebody in an argument and you argue forever, when after all of your reasoning has been exhausted, all you're left with is to see who has the most emotional strength or physical strength or whatever. You finally resort to one of the informal fallacies or another to settle the issue. Is there any way to test, at least formally, the truth of somebody's reasoning? Yes. And how many times are you in a debate when you say, well, that's irrational, or that's logic, or that's illogical, or that's absurd, and somebody says, yeah, I don't see your point, Sproul. And then you say, let me show it to you. You know there's a way to do it? Visually? By the use of the Venn diagram? By taking the argument and putting in the syllogistic form, and then from the syllogistic form showing visually by these Venn diagrams after we get the completed procedure by learning how to throw the middle term into that, then we can graphically demonstrate in a visible way a logical fallacy, a formal fallacy. That's the value of this. And if you take the time to learn this, it can be very, very helpful in saving a lot of wasted time and breath and energy and emotional upheaval by unnecessary argumentation. Okay? So what we'll do the next time is build on this the Venn diagram in its entirety as a way to test the validity of syllogistic reasoning. And we'll do that next time.